Okinawa, April 28, 1945. 4 weeks into the bloodiest battle of the Pacific War, Corporal Thomas Sullivan carried a dying girl 800 meters through enemy fire. He thought saving one life would be enough. By dawn, 200 more stood outside his tent, choosing survival over honor, and changing everything he thought he knew about war. The shells came in waves, each explosion closer than the last. USS Tennessee's 16-inch guns had been pounding the southern Okinawa cliffs for 3 hours, and inside the cave hospital carved into limestone beneath Yaijudake Ridge, 17-year-old Sachiko Nakamura pressed her hands against her ears until they bled. 6 days. 6 days since the tunnels had been sealed by American flamethrower teams. 6 days without water except what dripped from the cave ceiling. 6 days watching her classmates from Shimabara Girls' School die one by one. Yuki from dysentery, Fumiko from untreated shrapnel wounds, Haruka who simply closed her eyes on the 4th day and never opened them again. Sachiko's school uniform, once crisp white with a navy blue sailor collar hung in filthy tatters, the brass school insignia pinned above her heart, a cherry blossom over an open book, was the only thing that still looked clean. She'd polished it obsessively with her thumb for 6 days, the only ritual that kept her mind from breaking. Around her in the darkness, 200 women and girls breathed in shallow gasps. Some were legitimate auxiliary nurses, women in their 20s with actual medical training. Most were like Sachiko, students between 15 and 19, mobilized 3 months ago under the Himiyuri Student Corps program, given a 2-week crash course in bandaging and amputations, then shoved into hell. Lieutenant Oshiro, the only remaining Imperial Japanese Army officer, sat near the deepest recess of the cave. He'd stopped issuing orders 2 days ago. His service pistol lay across his lap. Everyone knew what it meant. When the Americans broke through, he would shoot as many girls as he could then himself. It was what the propaganda films called dying with honor. It was what the Emperor expected. Sachiko hallucinated between the explosions. She saw her mother's kitchen in Naha, smelled miso soup, felt clean tatami mats beneath her feet. Then another shell hit and the vision shattered into limestone dust and the copper stench of infected wounds. The youngest girl, Michiko, just 15, had lied about her age to enroll, whispered from the darkness. "Sachiko-san, I'm scared." Sachiko wanted to say something comforting. Instead, she heard her own voice, distant and cracked. "We'll be with our ancestors soon. That's what Sensei told us." But she didn't believe it anymore. Sachiko had stopped believing on the 3rd day, when she watched a wounded soldier bite through his own tongue, rather than cry out and give away their position. The propaganda had promised glory. This was just dying slowly in the dark. Above ground, dawn broke gray and cold over the wreckage of what had once been Okinawan farm villages. Corporal Thomas Sullivan, 24, medic with the 96th Infantry Division, 10th Army, stood at the edge of a bomb crater and watched smoke rise from a dozen tunnel entrances along the ridgeline. He'd been on Okinawa for 4 weeks. It felt like 4 years. Tom was a big man, 6'2", with farmer's hands and a Midwestern jawline that made him look older than he was. Back in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, he'd been 2 years into pre-med at the state university when his draft notice came in January 1943. By March 1944, he was in the Pacific. By April 1945, he'd seen enough death to fill several lifetimes. His medical kit, a canvas bag with a red cross painted on the side, hung heavy on his hip. Morphine syrettes, sulfa powder, compress bandages, iodine swabs. He'd restocked yesterday at the field hospital. Today he'd probably use everything. "Sullivan, move your ass." Sergeant Kowalski, the patrol leader, waved from 30 yards ahead. "We're clearing Cave 14. Lieutenant says it's a hospital tunnel. Expect wounded." Tom jogged forward, mud sucking at his boots. The cleanup patrols were exactly what they sounded like. Go into tunnels that had been hit with explosives or flamethrowers, check for survivors, kill holdouts if necessary. Mark the cave cleared. Some days they found wounded civilians who'd stumbled into military positions. Some days they found whole families who'd committed suicide with grenades. Some days they found nothing but corpses. Cave 14's entrance was a jagged wound in the hillside still smoking from the satchel charge that had been tossed in last night. The patrol, 8 men, approached with rifles raised. Standard procedure, shout warnings in Japanese, throw in a smoke grenade, wait for movement. Dete koi, Kowalski shouted, reading phonetically from a laminated card. Come out. You will not be harmed. Silence. They threw the smoke grenade. Purple smoke billowed out of the entrance, drifting up into the morning mist. Still nothing. All right, we go in. Sullivan, your rear guard. Anybody wounded, you patch 'em fast and we move. No heroics. Tom nodded. He'd heard no heroics before. It meant, don't waste time on people who won't make it. The patrol entered the cave in a tactical column, flashlights cutting through smoke and darkness. The smell hit immediately. Gangrene, human waste, death. Tom's light swept across the first chamber. Empty ammunition crates, discarded uniforms, a shattered radio set. Deeper. The tunnel split into 3 branches. Kowalski pointed right. 50 feet in, they found the first bodies. 3 Japanese soldiers, dead from blast trauma, their uniforms blown open, intestines pooling on the stone floor. One still clutched a Type 99 rifle. Clear the weapon, Kowalski ordered. A private kicked the rifle away, checked pulses. Dead. Mark it. Keep moving. The next chamber had been a surgical area. Crude tables made from doors laid across ammunition crates. Blood-stained surgical tools scattered across the floor. A broken kerosene lamp. And in the corner, 3 dead women in white nurse uniforms, their bodies arranged neatly, hands folded across their chests. Suicide. Probably poison or grenades with the pins not fully pulled. Jesus Christ, someone muttered. Tom knelt beside them, checked anyway. Cold. Stiff. Dead for at least a day. Young, maybe early 20s. He saw a school photograph tucked into one woman's breast pocket. A graduating class, smiling girls in sailor uniforms. He left it there. Sullivan, we're moving. Nothing we can do. They went deeper. The tunnel narrowed, then opened into a larger cavern. Flashlights swept across and stopped. At least 40 more bodies. Women, girls, some soldiers, piled in the back of the cave like cordwood. The blast hadn't reached here. These people had died from starvation, disease, or suicide. The smell was overwhelming. Tom had to step outside for air. He leaned against the cave wall, hands on his knees, breathing through his mouth. 4 weeks. 4 weeks of this. How much more could... Sullivan, live one. He was moving before he thought, back into the tunnel, toward Kowalski's voice. Near the entrance of a side passage, barely visible in the smoke, a figure lay crumpled against the wall. Tom's flashlight illuminated her. A girl, 17 or 18, in a shredded school uniform. Sailor collar torn, skirt burned at the hem, bare feet bleeding. She was tiny, couldn't weigh more than 85 pounds. Her eyes were half open, unfocused, lips cracked and bleeding. Tom dropped to his knees beside her, fingers finding her neck. Pulse. Weak, thready. Maybe 40 beats per minute. Severe dehydration, malnutrition, possible shock. She was alive, but barely. Got a live one, Kowalski said into his radio. Female, civilian auxiliary, critical condition. Requesting immediate evac. The radio crackled back. Negative. Removal teams are 2 hours out. Mark the location and continue sweep. Kowalski looked at Tom. You heard him. Mark her for the medics, we move. Tom stared at the girl. Her breathing was so shallow he could barely see her chest rise. 2 hours. She wouldn't last 30 minutes. Sullivan, that's an order. Tom made a decision that would change everything. He slung his rifle across his back, slid his arms beneath the girl's shoulders and knees, and lifted. She weighed nothing. He could feel every rib, every vertebra. Her head lolled against his chest and she made a small sound. Not quite a whimper, not quite a breath. What the hell are you doing? Kowalski demanded. She won't make it 2 hours. Field hospital is 800 meters. I can get her there in 15 minutes. We're in the middle of a sweep. You leave your squad, you're looking at an Article 15. Tom adjusted his grip on the girl, her head settling into the crook of his arm. Write me up. I'll be back in 30. He turned and started walking. Sullivan! God damn it, Sullivan! But Tom was already out of the cave into the gray dawn, carrying a dying enemy soldier toward a place she'd been taught to fear more than death itself. The 800 meters from Cave 14 to the 10th Army Field Hospital were the longest of Tom Sullivan's life. The terrain was a moonscape. Craters, shattered trees, burned-out Type 95 tanks tilted into ditches. The mud sucked at his boots with every step. Twice he had to detour around unexploded ordnance. Once, a sniper round cracked overhead from a distant ridgeline, and Tom crouched in a crater for 30 seconds before moving again, the girl's body a fragile weight against his chest. She drifted in and out of consciousness. Sometimes her eyes fluttered open, dark brown, unfocused, and she would murmur in Japanese. Tom didn't speak the language, but he recognized the cadence of prayer, or maybe delirium. Her lips moved soundlessly, and once she whispered a single word clearly, "Oka-san, mother." "Stay with me," Tom said, knowing she couldn't understand. "Just stay with me. We're almost there." He slipped in the mud, went down on one knee, caught himself before dropping her. Pain shot through his leg, an old shrapnel wound from Lady that never quite healed. But he gritted his teeth and pushed upright. "Keep moving." The field hospital came into view, a cluster of 12 large tents arranged in a grid, marked with huge red crosses painted on white canvas. Jeeps and ambulances parked in neat rows. A triage station at the entrance, manned by 2 corpsmen and a nurse. Beyond that, the familiar organized chaos of battlefield medicine, doctors shouting orders, wounded men on stretchers, the hiss of sterilizers, the smell of ether and blood. Tom staggered up to the triage station. The nurse on duty, Lieutenant Margaret O'Brien, a veteran from the Philippines campaign, looked up from a clipboard and her eyes widened. "Sullivan? What? Who is that?" "Japanese auxiliary nurse. Found her in Cave 14. Critical dehydration, malnutrition, possible internal injuries. She needs fluids now." Margaret was already moving, calling for a stretcher. "Bay 7, get me an IV setup. Corporal Patterson, rinse station first, then saline drip." They transferred the girl from Tom's arms to the stretcher with practiced efficiency. She was so light that one corpsman carried her alone. Margaret walked alongside, fingers on the girl's wrist, counting pulse. "Jesus, she's barely there." "Sullivan, you carried her how far?" 800 meters, maybe more." Margaret shot him a look, half admiration, half exasperation. "You're lucky you didn't get shot. Kowalski's going to have your ass." "I know." They entered the hospital complex. Bay 7 was a smaller tent reserved for POW intake and processing. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of chlorine and DDT. 2 large barrels stood near the entrance, one filled with chlorinated water for drinking, the other a delousing station. Beyond that, 6 cots arranged in 2 rows, an examination table and a locked cabinet containing medical supplies. 2 other Japanese prisoners were already there, an elderly man with a bandaged head, unconscious, and a teenage boy with a shattered leg, sedated and restrained. A military police officer sat on a stool near the entrance, rifle across his lap, watching with bored detachment. The corpsman laid the girl on the examination table. Margaret cut away what remained of her uniform with surgical scissors, revealing a body that was more skeleton than flesh, ribs protruding, collarbones sharp as blades, skin stretched so tight across her pelvis that Tom could see the individual bones of her hip joints. "Christ," Margaret muttered. "When's the last time she ate?" "Cave was sealed 6 days ago," Tom said. "Maybe longer before that." Margaret inserted an IV with practiced precision. The girl's veins were so collapsed it took 2 tries. Saline solution began dripping into her arm. Another corpsman checked her pupils with a penlight, took her temperature, listened to her heart. Temperature 95 degrees. Heart rate 42. Blood pressure 70/40. She's in hypovolemic shock. Margaret looked at Tom. "You got her here just in time. Another hour and we'd be tagging her." Tom watched the girl's chest rise and fall, each breath still dangerously shallow. Her face, beneath the grime and blood, was delicate, almost childlike. The school insignia he'd noticed in the cave was still pinned to her torn collar, a cherry blossom over an open book. She'd kept it through everything. "What's her prognosis?" Tom asked. "If the fluids work and we can get some calories into her without her going into refeeding syndrome, maybe 60-40 in her favor." Margaret covered the girl with a clean blanket, then turned to Tom. "You did good. Stupid, but good. Now get back to your patrol before Kowalski writes you up." Tom nodded, but he didn't move. He stood there, watching the slow drip of saline into the girl's arm, the slight flutter of her eyelids, the almost imperceptible rise of her chest. He'd carried wounded men before, fellow soldiers, brothers in arms. This felt different. She was the enemy. She'd been prepared to die for an emperor who considered surrender worse than death, and yet here she was, clinging to life by a thread, hooked to an American ivu, surrounded by American voices. What would she think when she woke up? "Sullivan, go." Margaret's voice was gentle but firm. "Yeah, okay." He turned toward the exit, then paused. "If she wakes up, if she asks, tell her—" He trailed off. What could he possibly tell her? Tell her she's safe. Margaret's expression softened. "I'll tell her." Tom walked out into the morning light, shouldered his rifle, and headed back toward the ridgeline where his squad was probably still clearing caves. He'd be back at the field hospital tonight. His tent was just 50 yards from Base 7, part of the medical support staff bivouac. He'd been assigned to POW registration and medical screening 2 weeks ago, a rotation designed to give frontline medics a break from combat patrols. He didn't know it yet, but in 12 hours everything would change, and it would start with the girl he'd just saved. Inside the cave network beneath Yaeju Dake Ridge, the whispers began an hour after Tom Sullivan carried Sachiko Nakamura away. Nurse Ayako Tanaka, 19, the de facto leader of the surviving Himeyuri Auxiliary Corps in Cave Complex 14B, had watched the American soldier through a crack in the tunnel wall. She'd seen him lift Sachiko, unconscious, half-dead Sachiko who hadn't spoken in 2 days, and carry her out into the daylight. She'd watched through the smoke and dust, expecting to hear a gunshot. The propaganda said Americans executed prisoners. The propaganda said they tortured women. The propaganda said death was preferable to capture. But no gunshot came. Ayako withdrew deeper into the tunnel, where 200 girls and women huddled in the darkness. 40 were from her school alone, Shimabara Girls Academy, class of 1945. They'd been mobilized together in March, processed through the Military Recruitment Center in Naha, given white armbands with red crosses, and sent to the field hospitals. Of the 50 girls who'd started together, 10 were already dead. "What did you see?" whispered Nurse Sato, 22, one of the few actual trained nurses among them. Her face was gaunt, eyes hollow. "They took Sachiko-san." Murmurs rippled through the darkness. Lieutenant Oshiro, still sitting in the deepest recess with his pistol, stirred. "Did they shoot her?" His voice was hoarse. "No, Lieutenant. The soldier carried her. Like—" Ayako hesitated. "Like she mattered." "Propaganda," someone whispered. "They'll torture her for information." But Ayako had seen the American's face. Young, exhausted, determined, and gentle, surprisingly gentle, as he'd adjusted Sachiko's weight in his arms, careful not to jar her. That wasn't the face of a man planning torture. "I think," Ayako said slowly, "they took her to a hospital." The silence that followed was profound. For 6 days, they'd been told the same thing. Americans show no mercy. Americans rape and kill. Americans are demons. Better to die here in the dark with honor intact than to fall into their hands. But what if it was a lie? Nurse Sato voiced what everyone was thinking. "If they're giving medical treatment, it's a trick," Lieutenant Oshiro snapped. "They'll use her to draw others out, then kill them all." "Or," Ayako said quietly, "we've been lied to." The tension was immediate. You didn't question imperial propaganda. You didn't question the emperor's wisdom. You didn't question orders, but Ayako was past caring about orders. She was past caring about honor. She looked around at the girls in the darkness, 16-year-olds who'd never kissed a boy, who'd never finished school, who'd been told dying for the emperor was their greatest purpose. And she was tired of watching them die, tired of the blood and the screaming and the endless, suffocating dark. "We have 2 choices," Ayako said. "Stay here and die, or take a chance that the Americans are telling the truth." "You're talking about surrender," Oshiro hissed. "I'm talking about survival." "Shameful. Disgusting. I should shoot you right now for even suggesting." "Then shoot me, Lieutenant." Ayako stood facing the officer in the darkness. "Shoot me and everyone who wants to live. But I've watched enough girls die in this cave. I've held enough hands while they choked on their own blood. If there's even a chance, even the smallest chance, that we can walk out of here alive, I'm taking it." For a long moment, no one spoke. Then a small voice from the back. "I want to see my mother again." Another voice. "I'm so thirsty." Another. "I don't want to die here." The murmurs grew. Not everyone. Some girls still clung to the propaganda, still believed surrender was worse than death. But slowly, steadily, Consensus formed. Ayako looked at the others. If they give Sachiko-san water and medicine, if she's alive tomorrow, we'll know they're telling the truth. And if she is? Sato asked. Then at dawn, we go out. With what? Someone asked. We can't just walk out, they'll shoot us. White flags, Ayako said. We tear bandages, make white flags. The international sign of surrender. If they're following their own rules, Geneva Convention, yes? They can't shoot people surrendering under white flags. You're gambling with 200 lives, Oshiro said. I'm gambling that life is worth fighting for, Lieutenant, even if it means letting go of honor. Oshiro didn't respond. He sat in the darkness, pistol on his lap, and said nothing. The girls began tearing strips of cloth, bandages, pieces of uniform, anything white. They worked in silence, preparing for a dawn that might bring salvation or slaughter. And in the American field hospital, Sachiko Nakamura stirred for the first time in 6 hours. Her eyes opened slowly. The first thing she saw was canvas, white canvas stretched overhead. A tent, American voices somewhere nearby, the smell of antiseptic. And on her arm, a needle, a tube, clear liquid dripping from a bag suspended above her. Panic hit like a wave. She tried to sit up, but her body wouldn't obey. Tried to scream, but her throat was too dry. Managed only a weak gasp. Her hands scrabbled at the IV line trying to pull it out. Hey, easy. Hands on her shoulders, gentle but firm. A woman's voice. You're okay. You're safe. Sachiko's vision focused. An American nurse, red cross on her cap, kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. Lieutenant Margaret O'Brien, though Sachiko had no way of knowing her name. Tasukete, Sachiko whispered. Help, though she didn't know if she meant help me escape or help me understand. Margaret called over her shoulder. She's awake. Someone find me that phrasebook. A young corpsman appeared with a battered Japanese-English phrasebook, standard issue for occupied territories. Margaret flipped through it frantically, found a page, and read haltingly, N. Zen. Desu. You. Safe. Sachiko stared at her. Safe. The American was saying she was safe, but that couldn't be true. The propaganda films, the training, Lieutenant Oshiro, everyone had said capture meant torture, rape, death. This had to be a trick. They'd give her medicine just to make her talk, then they'd... Mizu. Margaret tried another phrase. Water. Thirsty. She held up a cup with a straw. Sachiko's throat screamed for it, but she turned her head away. Accepting it meant accepting capture. Accepting capture meant betraying the Emperor. But her body betrayed her first. Her lips trembled, her throat convulsed. And when Margaret placed the straw against her mouth, Sachiko drank. The water was cold, clean, chlorinated. It tasted like life. She drank until the cup was empty and Margaret immediately refilled it. Sachiko drank again, slower this time, and felt her thoughts beginning to clear. She was alive. She was in an American hospital. She had an IV in her arm. And the Americans were giving her water. Maybe the propaganda was wrong. The thought was terrifying and liberating in equal measure. Rest now, Margaret said, patting her shoulder. Sleep. Tomorrow, food. Okay. Sachiko didn't understand all the words, but she understood the tone. She let her eyes close. Within minutes, exhaustion pulled her under. Margaret watched her sleep for a moment, then wrote on her chart. Patient conscious, responsive, accepted fluids. Prognosis improving. She hung the chart at the foot of the bed and stepped outside for air. The sun was setting over the wreckage of Okinawa, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. Tom Sullivan was walking up from the bivouac area, still in his muddy patrol gear. How is she? He asked. She'll live, thanks to you. Tom nodded, relief evident on his face. Good. That's good. Margaret studied him. You know you can't get attached, right? She's a POW. When she's stable, she gets transferred to the civilian stockade. You'll probably never see her again. I know. But Margaret saw the way he looked toward Bay 7, and she knew he didn't really believe it. Neither did she. Because that night, as Tom Sullivan lay in his tent and Sachiko Nakamura slept under guard in Bay 7, 200 women in the tunnels were making white flags and preparing to bet their lives on mercy. Tom woke to the sound of voices at 5:30 hours. Not the usual morning sounds, mess call, truck engines, distant artillery. These were different, surprised, urgent. He pulled on his boots and stepped out of his tent into the gray pre-dawn light, and stopped dead. They stood in a line stretching from his tent all the way to the medical supply depot. At least 200 women and girls, organized in ranks like soldiers on parade. But these weren't soldiers. They were children wearing the torn remnants of school uniforms, young women in blood-stained white nurses' dresses, teenagers with bare feet and hollow eyes. Every single one held a makeshift white flag, torn bandages, strips of cloth, pieces of shirts. They stood silent, trembling, waiting. At the front of the line stood a young woman with short black hair and a medical armband, Ayako Tanaka, though Tom didn't know her name yet. She held her white flag with both hands and stared straight ahead, jaw set, terrified and defiant at once. Tom's mind went blank. He'd expected routine morning duties, paperwork, maybe a couple new POWs from overnight patrols. Not this. Not an army of starving girls surrendering en masse. "Lieutenant O'Brien," he shouted. "Lieutenant!" Margaret emerged from the surgical tent, took one look at the scene, and swore under her breath. Mother of God. She turned to the MP guard. "Get Colonel Hartman, now, and call the Provost Marshal's office. We're going to need interpreters, registration staff, food, medical supplies." She was already moving toward the line, her medical instincts overriding everything else. More personnel poured out of the tents, doctors, nurses, corpsmen, MPs. Within minutes, the entire field hospital staff stood frozen, staring at the silent line of surrendering women. Colonel Hartman, the senior medical officer, arrived in a jeep within 5 minutes. He was a career officer, 53, gray-haired and calm under fire. He'd overseen mass casualty events from Normandy to Iwo Jima, but even he stopped short at the sight. "How many?" he asked Margaret. "I'm counting maybe 200. 210? Jesus Christ." Hartman rubbed his face. "All right, we follow protocol. Geneva Convention, Article 28, medical personnel are retained, not prisoners of war. We'll need to verify their status, but assume anyone with a nurse's uniform or medical training stays here to help treat Japanese wounded. The rest go to civilian stockade after processing." "Colonel, they're in bad shape," Margaret said. "Malnutrition, dehydration. Half of them look like they'll collapse any second. Then we triage. Life-threatening cases first, then registration. Sullivan." Hartman turned to Tom. "This is your area. Get them organized. Water first, medical screening second, food third. Controlled portions, nothing heavy or we'll kill them with kindness. Move." Tom nodded and approached the line. Ayako watched him come, her knuckles white around her white flag. "English?" Tom asked gently. "Small," Ayako said, holding her fingers an inch apart. "Small English. You're in charge?" She nodded. "Okay. We're going to help you. Medical treatment, water, food. Understand?" Ayako's eyes searched his face, looking for deception, for cruelty, for the demons the propaganda had promised. She saw only exhaustion and something that might have been kindness. "Sachiko?" she asked suddenly. "Sachiko Nakamura? You take yesterday?" Tom's eyes widened. "You know her?" "School, same school. She alive?" "Yes, she's alive. She's here." He pointed toward Bay 7. "Hospital, medicine, she's okay." Ayako's composure cracked. Tears spilled down her cheeks and she covered her mouth with one hand. Behind her, the whispers rippled through the line. "Sachiko is alive. They gave her medicine. She's okay." The decision to surrender had been a gamble. Now they knew they'd chosen correctly. Tom raised his voice, speaking slowly. "Water first, then doctor check. Everyone okay. No one hurt. Understand?" Ayako translated in rapid Japanese. The tension in the line eased slightly. Some girls began to cry. Others swayed on their feet, exhaustion finally catching up now that the terror was fading. "Corpsman," Tom called. "Bring water, and get stretchers. We've got at least a dozen who won't make it through triage standing up." The field hospital transformed into controlled chaos. Corpsmen moved down the line with canteens of chlorinated water, helping those too weak to hold the canteens themselves. Margaret and 2 other nurses set up triage stations, checking vital signs, marking the most critical cases with red tags for immediate treatment. Tom worked methodically, moving from woman to woman, asking simple questions in broken Japanese from his phrasebook. "Pain? Where? Can you walk?" He marked clipboards, directed traffic, caught a 16-year-old girl when she collapsed mid-line and carried her to a medical tent. As the sun rose fully, the scene became surreal. 200 enemy combatants being treated with the same care as American wounded. MPs standing guard, rifles ready but not raised. Nurses, American and Japanese, working side by side. The smell of rice gruel cooking in massive pots, because the mess sergeant had been roused from bed and told to prepare breakfast for 200 starving civilians. And at the center of it all, Tom Sullivan, the medic who'd carried one dying girl 800 meters and somehow triggered a mass surrender. By 0800 hours, the initial triage was complete. 16 women were in critical condition and moved to intensive care. 43 had serious but non-life-threatening injuries or illnesses. The rest were marked for registration, delousing, food, and eventual transfer. Colonel Hartman pulled Tom aside. "You realize what you've done? Sir, that girl you brought in yesterday, they saw you. They watched you carry her to safety. That's why they came here. They came to you specifically." Hartman shook his head. "One act of mercy just saved 200 lives. I'm writing you up for a commendation. But first," he added wryly, "you're going to spend the next 12 hours doing intake paperwork." Tom looked back at the line of women, now seated on the ground, drinking water, some eating small portions of rice gruel. Ayako was helping an elderly nurse who could barely walk. A teenage girl was crying quietly while a corpsman bandaged her feet. "Understood, sir," Tom said. He didn't tell the colonel that he wasn't thinking about commendations. He was thinking about the girl in Bay 7, the one who'd started all of this without even knowing it. He wondered if she was awake yet, wondered if she knew what her survival had meant. Inside Bay 7, Sachiko Nakamura opened her eyes to find Ayako Tanaka sitting beside her bed, holding her hand. "You're alive," Ayako whispered in Japanese, tears streaming. "You're alive, and because of you we all are." Sachiko didn't understand yet. She was too weak, too confused. But as the morning wore on and she watched through the tent flaps as 200 of her sisters were processed, fed, and cared for by the enemy she'd been taught to fear, understanding came slowly. She had been saved. And in being saved, she had saved others. The weight of it was crushing and beautiful at once. The next 3 days passed in a blur of bureaucracy, medicine, and slow cultural collision. The 60 women identified as trained medical personnel, including Sachiko and Ayako, were classified under the Geneva Convention as retained personnel. This meant they weren't technically prisoners of war, but they weren't free either. They were held under military guard and assigned to work in the Japanese POW medical ward, a segregated tent complex set up to treat wounded Japanese soldiers and civilians who'd been captured in the previous weeks. The remaining 140 women and girls were processed through registration, given basic medical treatment, deloused with DDT powder, issued clean prison uniforms, and transferred to the civilian stockade 3 miles inland. Most went quietly. Some wept. A few still looked terrified, convinced this mercy was temporary. Tom Sullivan barely slept those 3 days. His duties expanded exponentially. He became the primary liaison between the American medical staff and the retained Japanese nurses. With the help of 2 translators, both Nisei soldiers from Hawaii, he taught them American medical protocols, supervised supply distribution, and mediated the inevitable cultural clashes. The first clash came on day 2. A Japanese POW, a sergeant maybe 30 with severe abdominal wounds, regained consciousness in the ward and immediately tried to kill himself by reopening his surgical incisions. 2 of the retained nurses, Sachiko and Ayako, stopped him. He screamed at them in Japanese, called them traitors, spat blood in their faces. Tom was there in seconds, restraints in hand. The sergeant fought like a demon, and it took Tom and 2 MPs to hold him down long enough for Margaret to sedate him. Afterward, in the quiet, Tom found Sachiko sitting outside the tent, shaking. Her hands were covered in the sergeant's blood, his and hers, from where he'd clawed her arms. Tom sat beside her without asking, medical kit in hand. He cleaned her wounds with iodine, applied bandages. She didn't resist, just stared at her hands. "He called me a traitor," she said in halting English. Tom was surprised. She'd been learning from Ayako, who'd studied English in school. He said, "I should have died. Should have honored Emperor. You honored life," Tom said quietly. "That's more important." "Is it?" She looked at him, and her eyes were full of something ancient and terrible. In your country, maybe. In mine. I am shamed. My family is shamed. When war ends, I can never go home. Tom didn't know what to say to that. The cultural gulf was too wide. So he just finished bandaging her arms and said, "You're alive. That's what matters." She didn't look convinced. But she came back to work the next day. The ward became its own strange world. American supplies, Japanese patients, bilingual chaos. Tom watched Sachiko and the other nurses navigate impossible situations, treating men who called them whores, comforting wounded soldiers who begged for poison to die with honor, performing triage while MPs stood guard in case someone tried to attack them. And slowly, grudgingly, things began to function. A wounded Japanese soldier, 19, lost his leg to gangrene. The amputation was performed by an American surgeon, assisted by Nurse Sato. The boy woke up, saw his missing leg, and began to weep. Sato held his hand for 6 hours straight, speaking softly in Japanese until he finally slept. An elderly Okinawan civilian, caught in artillery fire, was brought in with shrapnel wounds across his back. He spoke only Okinawan dialect, which none of the translators understood. Ayako spoke enough to communicate. She stayed with him through surgery, translating for the doctors, and afterwards sang him a lullaby her grandmother had taught her. He died quietly that night, but not alone. A 15-year-old boy, a conscripted student like Sachiko had been, arrived delirious with infection. Margaret wanted to amputate his arm to save his life. The boy refused, said he'd rather die than live disabled. Sachiko sat with him for 2 hours, speaking Japanese Tom couldn't understand. Finally, the boy agreed. The surgery saved his life. Afterward, Tom asked Sachiko what she'd said. "I told him living with one arm is hard, but living is still better than dying. I told him I chose to live. I asked if he was brave enough to do the same. And he believed you?" "He wanted to believe me. That was enough." Tom began to see her differently, not as the dying girl he'd carried from a cave, but as someone with her own strength, her own courage. She moved through the ward like a ghost, silent and efficient, but there was steel beneath the fragility. On the 4th day, an incident shattered the fragile peace. A Japanese lieutenant, a holdout officer captured after a firefight, was brought into the ward with multiple gunshot wounds. He was stable enough for surgery, but while waiting for the operating room, he grabbed a scalpel from a tray and lunged at the nearest American nurse. Tom was across the tent. He saw it happen in slow motion. The lieutenant rising from his cot, scalpel raised, murder in his eyes. The nurse, a young woman from Ohio, barely 22, frozen in shock, and Sachiko, stepping between them. The scalpel slashed across her shoulder, a deep cut that sprayed blood across the tent floor. She didn't scream, just caught the lieutenant's wrist with both hands and held on while Tom tackled him from behind. It took 4 men to subdue the officer. They restrained him, sedated him, locked him in an isolation tent under armed guard. Margaret stitched Sachiko's shoulder. 15 stitches would definitely scar, while Tom stood nearby, hands still shaking from adrenaline. "Why did you do that?" Margaret asked as she worked the needle. "He could have killed you." Sachiko winced but didn't pull away. "He would have killed her. She is helping us. I could not let her die." "You saved an American nurse's life," Margaret said quietly. "You know that changes things, right?" "Changes what?" "How people see you. How the command sees you. You're not just a POW anymore." Sachiko didn't respond. She just looked at Tom, and there was a question in her eyes he couldn't quite read. That night, Colonel Hartman summoned Tom to his office. "The Japanese nurse, Nakamura, is it?" "Yes, sir. She saved Lieutenant Morrison's life today. Morrison's already written a statement for the record." Hartman leaned back in his chair. "Sullivan, I'm getting pressure from above to move all the retained personnel to the main POW compound. Command thinks it's too risky keeping them here, especially after today's incident." Tom's chest tightened. "Sir, if you move them, they can't help with the Japanese wounded. We're already short-staffed, and the Japanese patients trust them. They won't trust us. I know, that's why I'm fighting it. But I need justification. Medical necessity. I can write a report, sir. Document every case where the retained nurses made the difference between life and death. There are dozens. Do it. 24 hours. Make it bulletproof." Hartman paused. "And Sullivan, don't get too attached to these people. When the war ends, and it will end soon, They're going back to Japan. You're going back to Iowa. That's how this works. Understood, sir. But Tom knew it was already too late for that warning. He spent that night writing the report by lamplight. 16 pages, single-spaced, documenting every instance where the retained nurses had saved lives, both American and Japanese. He included statements from Margaret, from the surgical team, even from 2 Japanese POWs who admitted they'd have killed themselves without the nurse's intervention. He didn't mention Sachiko specifically more than necessary, but she was on every page, in every case, the quiet presence that made everything work. At 0200 hours exhausted, he stepped out of his tent for air. Bay 7 was 50 yards away, still lit by kerosene lamps. He could see shadows moving inside, the night shift nurses checking on patients. One shadow separated from the others, stepped outside. Sachiko. Her shoulder was bandaged, arm in a sling. She stood in the lamplight, looking up at the stars. Tom walked over without thinking. You should be resting. She didn't startle, just glanced at him. Cannot sleep. Too much thinking. About what? She was quiet for a long moment, then. In my country, we are taught death is honorable, surrender is shame. But here, she gestured at the tent behind her. Here, we save lives. Even enemy lives. Even our own lives. And I think, maybe I was taught wrong. You weren't taught wrong, Tom said carefully. You were taught what your leaders wanted you to believe. There's a difference. Yes. But now I know difference I can never unknow. When I go back to Japan, if I go back, I will be traitor. But if I stay here, she shook her head. I am enemy. I will always be enemy. You saved an American life today. That doesn't sound like an enemy to me. She looked at him, and for the first time, Tom saw something other than trauma in her eyes, something almost like hope. Your name, she said suddenly. I know you are corporal, but your name, Tom, Thomas Sullivan, Tom-san. She tried the name, stumbling slightly over the pronunciation. I am Sachiko. You already know, but I wanted to say, nice to officially meet you, Sachiko. A small, fragile smile. Yes, official. They stood together in the lamplight. 2 people from opposite sides of a war connected by an act of mercy neither had expected. Somewhere in the distance, artillery rumbled. The war wasn't over. But for this moment, in this small space, it felt very far away. Tom submitted his report the next morning. Colonel Hartman forwarded it up the chain. 3 days later, the order came back. Retained personnel would remain at the field hospital for the duration of their medical necessity. Transfer to the POW compound postponed indefinitely. Margaret told Tom the news with a knowing look. You made a hell of a case, Sullivan. Command actually listened. Just following protocol, ma'am. Sure you were. She smiled. Keep following it. And keep an eye on your nurses, especially Nakamura. She's turning into a damn good medic. She was. Over the next 2 weeks, Sachiko became indispensable. She learned basic English medical terminology. She could start an IV on her first try, even on patients with collapsed veins. She had a way with the traumatized Japanese POWs, a quiet authority that made them trust her when they wouldn't trust anyone else. And slowly, impossibly, she and Tom became something like friends. They worked side by side during the day, navigating language barriers with gestures and broken phrases. At night, when the ward was quiet, they sometimes talked, stilted conversations about small things. He told her about Iowa, about cornfields, and winters that turned the world white. She told him about Okinawa before the war, about the ocean and the festivals and the school she'd loved. They didn't talk about the war. That was too close, too raw. But once late at night, while checking on a patient, Sachiko asked, Tom-santi, why did you carry me? That day. You did not have to. He thought about it. Because you were dying, and I'm a medic. That's what we do. But I am enemy. You're a human being. That comes first. She absorbed that. Then quietly. In cave, we were told Americans have no honor, no mercy. We were told you would kill us or worse. But you are not what they said. Neither are you, Tom replied. I was told Japanese soldiers would fight to the death, that surrender was impossible. But here you are. Here you all are, choosing to live. Is that bravery or cowardice? It's survival. and survival takes more courage than dying. She looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. I think you are right. May turned to June. The Battle of Okinawa ground toward its brutal conclusion. The casualty numbers mounted. Thousands of Americans, tens of thousands of Japanese, uncountable Okinawan civilians caught in the crossfire. The field hospital overflowed. Tents expanded. Surgeons worked 18-hour shifts. The retained nurses worked alongside them, no longer prisoners but partners in the desperate work of keeping people alive. And then, on June 8, 1945, Tom received new orders. Transfer to Saipan for R&R, then stateside rotation, effective in 48 hours. He was going home. He should have been overjoyed. 16 months in the Pacific. Leyte, Okinawa, endless months of mud and blood and death. He'd earned this. He'd survived. He was going back to Iowa, back to clean sheets and his mother's cooking in a world where people didn't die every day. But when he told Margaret, all he felt was empty. You knew this was coming, she said gently. Everyone rotates home eventually. I know. You going to tell her? He didn't have to ask who her was. Yeah, I should. He found Sachiko in the ward, changing bandages on an elderly patient. She worked with careful precision, hands steady. Her shoulder had healed well. Just a scar now, a thin line across her skin. Sachiko, can I talk to you? She looked up, immediately reading his expression. You are leaving. Not a question. A statement. Orders came through. I ship out in 2 days. She finished tying the bandage, spoke to the patient in Japanese, then stepped outside with Tom. They walked to the edge of the hospital compound where the tents gave way to empty ground and a view of the ocean in the distance. Where will you go? She asked. Saipan first, then back to America. Iowa. You will see cornfields again. Yeah. He tried to smile. You remembered. I remember everything you tell me. She was quiet for a moment. I am glad you go home. You should not be in war anymore. You should be doctor. Save people in peaceful place. What about you? What happens when the war ends? She looked at the ocean. I do not know. Maybe I stay in Okinawa. Maybe I go to mainland Japan. Maybe I am prisoner forever. Her voice was steady, but Tom heard the uncertainty beneath it. But I am alive, because of you. So whatever happens, I am grateful. Tom reached into his pocket and pulled out a piece of paper, torn from a notebook, folded carefully. This is my address, in Iowa. If you ever need anything, if you need help getting settled after the war, or if you just want to write, you can reach me here. She took the paper with both hands, held it like something precious. You think I will write? I don't know, but I want you to have the choice. She unfolded the paper, looked at the address written in Tom's careful handwriting. Then she refolded it and tucked it inside her uniform pocket, over her heart. I will keep this, she said. And I will remember the man who carried me from darkness. I'll remember the woman who chose to live. They stood together, watching the sun sink toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and red. In 2 days, Tom would be gone. The war would continue. Sachiko would remain here, caring for the wounded, navigating an uncertain future. But for this moment, they were just two people who'd found each other in the worst of circumstances and proven that mercy was possible even in war. The next day, the other retained nurses learned of Tom's departure. At lunch, they presented him with a collection of origami cranes, 60 of them, folded from scraps of paper, bandages, anything they could find. Each crane represented a life saved, a kindness remembered. Ayako, speaking for the group, said in careful English, "We will not forget. You showed us Americans have honor, too." Tom couldn't speak. He just accepted the cranes, held them carefully, and nodded. That night, his last night at the field hospital, he packed his gear by lamplight. The origami crane sat on his footlocker, 60 tiny paper birds. He wrapped them carefully in a clean cloth and placed them at the bottom of his duffel bag. At 600 hours on June 10th, a transport truck arrived. Tom said his goodbyes to Margaret, to the surgical team, to the corpsmen he'd worked with for months. Then he walked toward Bay 7 one last time. Sachiko stood outside, waiting. She'd known he'd come. "Safe travels, Tom-san," she said. "You too. Stay safe and—" he hesitated. "Keep choosing life, Even when it's hard. I will try. He wanted to say more. Wanted to promise they'd see each other again, that the war would end, and she'd be okay, and the world would make sense again. But he couldn't promise any of that. So he just touched 2 fingers to his forehead in a small salute. She bowed, a precise formal bow that somehow conveyed everything words couldn't. Then Tom climbed into the truck and it drove away. Sachiko stood watching until the truck disappeared over the ridge. Then she returned to the ward, where patients needed her, where work would keep her mind from breaking. She didn't cry. She'd forgotten how. But that night she took out the paper with Tom's address and read it by lamplight, memorizing every word. The Battle of Okinawa officially ended on June 22, 1945. Over 12,000 American military dead. Over 100,000 Japanese military dead. Between 100,000 and 150,000 Okinawan civilian casualties. The island was secured at a cost that would haunt everyone who'd fought there for the rest of their lives. Of the 297 Himeyuri Student Corps members mobilized in March 1945, 211 died, a 71% casualty rate. The survivors carried those losses forever. The retained nurses, including Sachiko Nakamura and Ayako Tanaka, were eventually repatriated to mainland Japan in late 1945, after the Japanese surrender. They faced a shattered country, food shortages, and the social stigma of having been POWs. Many survivors never spoke about their experiences, the shame too great to bear. But some chose differently. Some chose to remember. In 1989, the Himeyuri Peace Museum was founded in Okinawa, dedicated to preserving the memory of the student nurses who'd died and educating future generations about the cost of war. Survivors gave testimony. Artifacts were collected. Names were carved in stone. And in a small town in Iowa, an elderly doctor named Thomas Sullivan donated a collection of 60 origami cranes to the museum, along with a handwritten account of the day he carried a dying girl from a cave and watched 200 others choose survival over death. The museum displayed the cranes in a glass case, accompanied by Sullivan's words, "War makes enemies of human beings, but mercy reminds us, we were human first." These cranes were given to me by women I was taught to fear, by people I was ordered to see as less than myself. They taught me that courage isn't found in fighting. It's found in choosing to live when everything tells you to die. I carried one woman 800 meters. She carried hope back to 200. That's what I want people to remember. In 1992, Sullivan returned to Okinawa for the first time in 47 years. He visited the museum. And there, among the visitors reading the testimonies, he saw a woman with short gray hair and a thin scar across her shoulder. Sachiko Nakamura had become Sachiko Ishikawa, a schoolteacher in Naha. She'd married, raised 2 children, and spent 40 years teaching peace education to Okinawan students. She'd never forgotten the American soldier who'd saved her life. They recognized each other immediately. No dramatic reunion, no tears. Just 2 elderly people who'd survived impossible things, meeting again in a place dedicated to remembering. "You kept choosing life," Tom said. "Because you showed me it was possible," Sachiko replied. They spent the afternoon walking through the museum together, reading the names of the dead, looking at photographs of young girls who'd never gotten the chance to grow old. They talked about the war, finally, after decades of silence. And they talked about what came after, the difficulty of surviving, the weight of memory, the slow work of building peace. Before Tom left, Sachiko gave him a photograph, the 2 of them standing in front of the origami crane display, 2 survivors bearing witness. "For your family," she said, "so they know the story." Tom returned to Iowa. He passed away in 1998 at 77, surrounded by family. The photograph sat on his desk until the end. Sachiko continued teaching until 2005. She passed away in 2011 at 83, having dedicated her life to ensuring the Himeyuri students were remembered not as statistics, but as individuals, girls with dreams, with families, with futures stolen by war. At her memorial service, her daughter read a letter Sachiko had written years before, to be opened after her death. "To the American soldier who carried me from darkness, I never wrote to your address in Iowa. I was too afraid, too ashamed, too uncertain, but I kept the paper for 65 years. It reminded me that even in war, mercy is possible. Even when we are taught to see each other as enemies, we can choose to see each other as human beings first. Thank you for giving me the chance to live. Thank you for showing 200 girls that survival was not shame but strength. I hope, wherever you are, you know that your kindness echoed through decades. Every student I taught, every young person I convinced that peace is worth fighting for, they are your legacy too. May we all remember that the bravest choice is often the simplest: to help when we can, to carry the wounded, to choose life, even when death seems easier. Rest in peace, Tom Sullivan, and know that you were not forgotten. The museum still displays the 60 origami cranes, faded now but carefully preserved. Beside them, a placard tells the story of Corporal Thomas Sullivan and Sachiko Nakamura, and the day 200 women lined up outside a tent, choosing hope over fear. Visitors leave their own origami cranes at the base of the display, thousands of them now, paper birds carrying prayers for peace. And on April 28th every year, the anniversary of that first rescue, museum staff place a single white crane at the front of the line, remembering the moment when mercy changed everything. If this story of courage, mercy, and choosing humanity in the darkest moments moved you, please take a moment to support this channel. Hit that subscribe button to join us in sharing powerful true stories that deserve to be remembered. Leave a like if you believe acts of compassion can change the course of history, even in war. And drop a comment below. What would you have done in Tom Sullivan's position? Would you have carried that dying girl 800 meters knowing it could cost you everything? Your thoughts keep these conversations alive and honor the memory of those who faced impossible choices. Thank you for watching, and for helping us ensure stories like Sachiko's and Tom's are never forgotten.